So first of all, thank you. Judith wasn't able to be here, but I thank her for organizing this cycle, which is very important, and for inviting me to speak today. My research stands between historical linguistics, social linguistics, and Jewish history. I'm particularly interested in the interplay of language and identity among the Jews of Spain on the eve of their expulsion in 1492, and among the first generations of Sephardic exiles in the Ottoman and Maghrebi contexts. I'm gonna share with you the screen, and hopefully we have this journey in the languages of the Sephardim. So I'll introduce and say that Jewish languages are interesting case studies for language contact and language evolution among minority or discriminated groups in intensive contact situations and upon extreme conditions such as traumatic expulsion or violence, and the emergence of Judeo-Spanish as well as Yiddish or Judeo-Arabic and other ethnolects or religiolects, if we use the terminology of Hari, can teach us about the general process of language evolution while highlighting the importance of ecologies for the birth and death of languages. So in this forum, it's probably, there is no need to elaborate on the definition of a Jewish language, but perhaps it would be convenient to have some working definition. So as a working definition, my proper definition for a Jewish language is that they are contact minority language varieties spoken or written by Jews in the diaspora, and which present some features differentiating them from the languages of non-Jews. From a social linguistic point of view, a Jewish language is a dialect or a language whose Jewish speakers or non-Jewish environment define as such, as Jewish, as shown by Benor and Hari and Vane. Since the definition of a language or a dialect as being Jewish depends greatly on the criteria set a priori for, it's much more useful to use Benny Hari's more dynamic approach in recent years of a continuum stretching from Jewish varieties or religiolects containing a high concentration of differentiating parameters to those with only a few or almost unnoticeable traits, or Sarbunin Benor's Jewish linguistic repertoires that ask for the variables in order to understand to what extent does the Jewish linguistic repertoire is different from those of the surrounding. And in terms of, in the case of the languages of the Iberian Jews, I take the approach of Benny Hari's on a continuum, on a scale, instead of dwelling on the question whether Judeo-Catalan, Judeo-Castilian, or Judeo-Portuguese existed or not. I prefer to use this kind of dynamic approach. And to describe the Jewish linguistic repertoire, or in other words, to describe the ecological or the linguistic ecology of these varieties. Admittedly, the title of the talk, The Language of the Sephardim, is somewhat ambitious, as each language that I will mention deserves its own lecture or a series of lectures. My work in the last years concentrated on the medieval period, wherein I examined the linguistic identity of the Jews of Christian Spain before the expulsion, in a monograph I'm working on under the tentative title, Language and Identity Among the Jews of Christian Spain. I look into manuscript written in Catalan, Aragonese, even Occitan, Castilian, Arabic, and Latin in Hebrew script from the 13th to the 15th centuries. And of course, when we treat the Jews of Spain, the first language that we should have treated would have been Judeo-Arabic, with 500 years of Jewish life in Muslim Spain or Al-Andalus, but this would tremendously exceed the time frame we have. So in this talk, I will concentrate on the Ibero-Romance language varieties. I will just mention that in recent study, I have examined the use of Arabic and Judeo-Arabic among the Jews of Christian Spain based on more than 200 Sephardic Arabic manuscripts from the 14th to 15th centuries, based on which I conclude that at least as a scientific language, Arabic perpetuated to late periods among the Jews of Christian Spain, probably until the expulsion. If you're interested in that, we can return to that in the QA. I actually speak on that specific topic next week within the Cultural Brokerage seminar in pre-modern Islam, if anyone is interested. I just brought you this example from the BNF, Pharmacopoeia manuscript from Aragon, mid-14th century, with the title Kitab Akrab ad-Din lil-Hakim al-Afdal al-Tubab al-Mahir Rabbi Moshe ben Ardut Rahmullah Mimma Jarraba wa Aada Sakhikhan. The title, the contents are in Arabic or Judeo-Arabic. And we can return to that to the QA if you wish. But we're gonna set our talk within the Castilian and Catalan realm more than anything, and mostly about the contact between Catalan and Castilian as well. There are many Iberian languages that were written in Hebrew script: Aragonese, Catalan, Aragonese, Castilian, Portuguese, Catalan. Who knows, in the Iberian Peninsula, we might find one day evidence of kind of Judeo-Basque. But does the use of the Hebrew alphabet and limited use of Hebrew lexicon suffice in order to declare these as distinctive languages? So the root of this debate, of course, goes to the case of Judeo-Castilian, or the roots of Judeo-Spanish. And scholars of Judaic studies tended to say, yes, there was a distinct Judeo-Castilian language and identity, linguistic identity of the Jews, while Hispanists tended to say, well, except for some Hebrew use, some archaic features, it's not really a language. Those in favor of proper Judeo-Castilian, such as Bunis, Schwarzwald, and Marcus, claim arguments. There is a shared Hebrew and Hispanic lexicon in all post-expulsion Judeo-Spanish dialects throughout North Africa, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire, which would mean that there was a prior linguistic identity. They also say that the highly unified biblical translation tradition that was printed already during the 16th century might designate an earlier linguistic identity, if not an oral tradition that was passed from generation that preserved archaic forms and the non-translation of specific Hebrew words that would have been relied on their specific speech. As regard to the first argument, indeed, in post-expulsion Judeo-Spanish, we find features that were common already in medieval time. In terms of the lexicon, these examples are much quoted in the scholarly literature. God is referred to El Dio and not Dios, since Jews reinterpreted the use of the final S as a marker of plurality, and in order not to say, to have reference to gods, but the God, the unity of God, then they preferred El Dio. Also, we find Jews avoiding terms that are Christian per se, not Domingo for Sunday, which is a clear reference to Jesus, Dies Dominicus, but the Andalusian Arabic feature, Al-Khad element. Also, a remnant of Judeo-Greek or Greek entered Castilian, Catalan, and also Provençal speech of the Jews. The verb meldar for meleteo, that entered also Judeo-Spanish, and not leer, to read, which is the common Spanish form. What more? Regarding the second argument, we have a great example of this kind of Judeo-Castilian in the famous community regulation, Takanot, of the Jews of Valladolid from 1432, which in fact shows us Castilian and Hebrew script with many, many Hebrew syntagmas, large syntagmas, not only lexem. I am going to read a few lines. Por ende somos metacnim umaskimim, que en cada kaal y kaal. So now we see somos metacnim umaskimim, the verb to be plus benoni poel, the benoni poel, or in Hebrew in plural. Then Hebrew kal, kada kaal y kaal. That's Hebrew kol קהילה וקהילה, כל קהל וקהל. Se aborerim dayanim, que liberen a sus plietos, como dicho es, lo sean mekablim bene הקהל עליהם, pero deben ser borerim los más rehuim והגונים. Even if you do not understand Castilian, you might perceive the use of large or long Hebrew syntagma within this legal legislative text that was regulated the life of the Jews of Valladolid in 15th century. And within medieval time, we already find the use of whole Hebrew, tzedakah, Pesach, mitzvah. These are not surprising since from the religious sphere, more interesting are fused Hebrew examples from Shabbat, Sabadear, from Mazal. This is not a religious word. From Mazal, if you're unfortunate, then you are desmazalado. From Cherem, to ban, to banish, and Cheremar. So we see fused or merged Hebrew that's more sophisticated, and in Judeo-Spanish later and after the expulsion, this would become very common. Also, we find a calc translation that entered the speech of the Jews already in medieval time, cada uno y uno, like we saw also cada kaal, that's a calc translation of Hebrew, or El Santo Bendicho El, translating Hakadosh Baruch Hu literally. And this biblical tradition is apparent in the Bibles of the 16th century, where we see the influence of the Hebrew syntax on the structure of the sentence. The word order is, for example, not rather than the Castilian demonstrative noun adjective, Hebrew noun adjective demonstrative is preferred. Not to say that in Castilian the other structure did not exist, but in 15th century Castilian, definitely the first structure would be preferred. So if we have Hebrew, Ketenim HaShoarim, translated in Ladino como los higos, los sucios. Note this, los higos, los sucios, to imitate Hebrew. And in Spanish Bible, como los higos sucios, sin the article. Another example, Isho HaGedolah, su fuego la grande, en Ladino, su fuego la grande, versus el su fuego poderoso. Here it's interesting because fuego was reinterpreted as feminine, according to Hebrew, while in Castilian the el fuego, not la fuego. Here it's reinterpreted su fuego, la grande, to concord with the Hebrew feminine gender of the word. And these kind of constructions from early 16th century became common in rabbinic and non-rabbinic literature of Judeo-Spanish. As shown by Garcia Moreno, he found example of the sort el mancebo, el este, el maestro, el grande, and even with both the demonstrative and the adjective, with the article and the adjective, el hijo, el preciado, el este, versus a phrase that would be in Castilian, este hijo preciado, for example. Much quoted is Genesis, the first line from Genesis, first verse, בראשית ברא אלוהים את השמיים ואת הארץ, והארץ הייתה, I can't see it here, בחושך על פני התהום וכולי, etc., etc., translated in the 16th century, en principio creó el Dios a los cielos y a la tierra. This a, the preposition a, imitates Hebrew et, the accusative marker, y la tierra era vagua y vacía, y oscuridad sobre fases de abismo. Here it's interesting that oscuridad sobre fases de abismo also imitate Hebrew syntax without a predicate, probably due to the influence of Hebrew. There are other options, but it's probably due to the Hebrew, since the Spanish Bible translation differ from that. So Hispanists are not persuaded by this. They say, Coloma Leal, for example, says, the texts are Jewish, not the language, except for some elements and Hebrew formulations. And Minervini adds, beyond the Hebrew lexicon, and except for a more frequent use of archaic features, then the Castilian texts in Hebrew script are nothing different from Castilian of Christian of the time. Still, where I remained with the doubt was does the except for impact, what does it mean? I think we can definitely say that even if we accept that the Castilian itself was 100% identical between the Jews and the Christian, we cannot say that the linguistic repertoire of the Jews or the ecology of their language was identical to that of their Christian neighbors. Their speech was full of Hebraism. We find in all of the documents and texts the incorporation of Hebrew lexeme and syntagma, not strictly limited to the religious and communal life. I found similar evidence from the Catalan realm. In fact, my dissertation was dedicated to Judeo-Catalan texts. I gathered a small corpus of texts written in Catalan and Hebrew script from the 14th and 15th centuries. And for a relatively small corpus, I found there a lot of popular, archaic, dialectal, non-registered, rarely registered features that are very interesting, of course, for the development of medieval Catalan, and raise the question again about Jewish differentiation. I'm not going to expand on that here. You could read that in my prior publication. I'm here interested to show you examples of contact between Catalan and Castilian in Jewish writings as I examine it under the scope of code switching and code mixing. Before I'm going to read that, I'm going to say that that in recent years, historical linguistics adopted the terminology of code switching for analyzing written multilingual records. This implementation regarding the oral speech into the text should not be seen as obvious. We know very little about the identity of the scribe of the manuscript that we're going to see now. We only know it's late 15th centuries. The scribe must have been Jewish, as he's used Hebrew script. It's Castilian mixed with Catalan. Philosophical definitions that I located in the writings of the Catalan philosopher from the 13th century, Ramon, Llull, that relied on a prior Catalan version that now lost today. Also, we need to remember the historical context. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile in 1469 brought a change in the royal court, also in terms of the linguistic policy, where we see a shift from Catalan to Castilian in Valencia and Catalonia by the 16th century, first among the aristocracy, where Castilian was preferred as the language of high culture and literature. While this process is known to have taken place at late 15th century and early 16th century, there is only a handful of documents that actually show these phases of shift. Hence, the following examples are also interesting for a non-Jewish context of studying language shift from Catalan to Castilian by the end of the 15th century. So I transcribed this manuscript. What we're going to see here, Castilian Spanish is unmarked, Catalan marked in bold. Forms that can be read in both languages are underlined, hybrid forms are in capital letters, and switching elements are marked in italics. And I must warn, these are philosophical definitions from taken from the 13th century and copied in the late 15th century, and hence the relative obscurity if you don't follow the definition themselves. We're going to read that, and you may follow in English. Capacidad es forma por la cual lo capaz puede comprender y contener las cosas que pueden ser compresas y contenidas por él. In this example, the code switching is triggered by bilingual homophones as defined by Klein, or what Woolard would define as bivalency strategy. Bivalency means that in both languages, the constituent is very similar or sounds very similar, and it is attested mainly in closely related languages such as current bilingual Catalan-Spanish speech. The term here, capacitat, capacity, is in Catalan inserted within a Castilian phrase until the relative que, which is a bivalent element in both languages, and that triggered a switch to Catalan, only to be switched back to Castilian after the bivalent element of the conjunction e. In another example, infinidad es aquella cosa que es sin término y mesura y es en tres modos, so es en grandeza, en duración y en nombre. Here too, the term of the definition, infinidad, is Catalan, followed by a long line of bivalent elements that could be read in both languages. Es aquella cosa que es, that could be read both as Castilian and Catalan. The first switch might have been triggered again by the relative que, or by the bivalent element of the verb to be, conjugated here, es. Single noun switches of Catalan or Catalan loanwords are inserted, such as mesura. In a different example, written by the scribe. Here, it's not from an earlier copy. It's the philosophical observation of the scribe, not known from other manuscripts. It's not from Ramon Llull, but it acts in a similar way to what we've seen. Qualitat, relación y acción y pasión, ele harba, that's Hebrew, pueden ser sustanciales y accidentales en natura creada y todos los otros accidentes. The first switch might have been triggered again by the relative, sorry. Yes, sorry. The mechanism is very similar here. The bivalent infinitive of the verb to be, esser, triggers the intranscendental code switch, code mixing from Catalan to Castilian in the noun phrase. Single noun switches such as natura or altras are inserted. It is important to say that while Woolard insists on the terminology of bivalency, others, such as Moiskin and Appel, use the terminology of neutralizing element. And among my examples, compromise or hybrid forms are also neutralizing element, which trigger the switching. What do I mean by that? In this example, predicación es art con la cual el doresh informa al hombre a ver buenas costumbres y esquivar las malas. One case of neutralization seems to include the elements of a third language, Hebrew, doresh, right? Which embellished, of course, the speech of Castilian and Catalan Jews. The intersentential code switching from Castilian to Catalan includes a long line of bivalent or neutral constituents, among which the Hebrew doresh, preacher, and since the verb informar and the following article are both identical in two languages, we cannot ascertain where the switch took place, but I favor the reading of a switch between the noun phrase, el doresh, and the verb phrase that follows. Note here that there is also a hybrid form, bonas. The basis is Catalan, bon, and the plural feminine is more Castilian, us, but that was kind of unstable in medieval Catalan. So we cannot ascertain that it's a hybrid, really, truly a hybrid form. What is the basic or the matrix language of that text? Well, it's Castilian. How do I know that? Because out of 480 tokens in the fragment, 262, that's 54%, were could be attributed to both languages, but clearly Castilian forms are 28% versus only 13% of clearly Catalan forms. And this is also the case with the verbal forms, where the bivalency strategy is preferred to many forms of the verb to be, ser or es, which are in the two languages, and more notable verbal forms in Castilian rather than Catalan forms. So we see here that bilingual homophones or the strategy of bivalency is preferred, converging between these two already similar languages. Hence, the code switching and code mixing between these relatively close languages, even in the written material, use the overlapping representation of lexical items and shared syntactic forms. The strategies of neutralization were that of bivalency, that of a neutral element in a third language, here Hebrew, and also there were some cases of hybrid or compromised forms which serve as an adequate locus for code switching. Could I ask the people who are not muted to mute themselves because there is some kind of noise? Thank you. So what all of these testimonies tell us? The testimonies of Catalan-Castilian mixing indicate that even prior to the expulsion, the Jews of Catalonia were already exposed to Castilian, at least among the elite circles. Interestingly, we find similar examples also from Portuguese texts. It was not only the quantitative advantage of the Castilian Jewish founders of Judeo-Spanish, but the linguistic contact and exposure of the Jews of Catalonia, Aragon, and Portugal prior to their expulsion that would serve as a catalyst for the Castilianization process and the shift to Castilian from other Ibero-Romance varieties that they spoke. And now, in fact, we move forward in time to proper Judeo-Spanish after the expulsion. So in a new research project that I just started at the Buber Society of Fellows at the Hebrew University, I wish to document the linguistic shift in favor of Castilian, not only among the non-Castilian Jewish exiles after they arrived in the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and Italy, and throughout the process of the cultural accommodation. Even more puzzling is the fact that Greek-speaking Jews, Romanites, shifted from Greek to Spanish and so became Sephardic without Iberian roots. Likewise, many Arabic-speaking Jews of North Africa, and particularly in Morocco, partially adopted Castilian without, however, losing command of Arabic. Hence, I ask, why did many non-Castilian and even non-Iberian Jews began to use Castilian in the first place? Well, it took some 200 years for the language of the Sephardim to fully consolidate and to reach linguistic maturity, quite similarly to development of other languages of the world, Latin American Spanish, Romance languages, many Creoles that takes 150, 200 years. And Judeo-Spanish established its independence towards mid-17th, early 18th century with vast rabbinic literature. An illustrative example from Bunis for the fused nature of Ladino is the following. El Jajam Estambulí se acabida de meldar a lo manco un jornal europeo cada día de Al-Had. What do we see here? El Jajam, that's Hebrew, right? Se acabida, that's probably Portuguese. Meldar, we've seen it's Judeo-Greek. A lo manco, that's Italian. Journal, that's French. Cada dia de, that's a Castilian construction. And Al-Had, that's Andalusian Arabic from the prior phases before the expulsion. Indeed, the fused nature of Ladino is what's so characteristic about Ladino, as well as of Yiddish, and so, as some of you know. we find Hebrew merged, garon, we take Hebrew garon, throat, adding Castilian suffixes, and we receive garronedad, now changes the semantics, gluttony, or garronudo, or the verb garronear. We take Hebrew chen, grace, we add the Castilian suffixes, and we receive genoso, genosa as graceful, or genosura, gracefulness. We can also take Hebrew lexem and add Turkish morphemes. We can take goral and receive goralji as fortune teller. We can take ben adam, Hebrew ben adam. In the plural, it's the Castilian suffix of plural, ben adames, but we can also add the Turkish suffix lik, and we receive ben adam lik, which makes the word humanness, to be courteous, to act like a human being, ben adam lik, right? So that's a very characteristic feature of Judeo-Spanish, and rabbinical writing is affluent with whole Hebrew component. In Me'am Lo'ez, an 18th century famous Judeo-Spanish commentary of the Bible, studies show around 12% of the lexicon from Hebrew, and popular and humorous writing in Judeo-Spanish are even more affluent with merged Hebrew, as shown by Schwarzwald. Consider all of that, I wanted to think about the crucial factors or ecological factors that could account for this kind of emergence of Judeo-Spanish. I'm going to concentrate on a few important ones: the founder principle, the contact with other languages, and the written legacy and relatively high literacy of the Jews, and internal innovations of Judeo-Spanish. These are not all the factors, but these are the most important that I want to share with you today. What do I mean by the founder principle? So here I take, I hope you see that in the bottom line, from Salicoco Mofuene's notion of regarding genesis of Creole languages. He speaks about the crucial importance for the development of Creoles, the founding populations that first had contact and the spoken vernaculars, non-standard vernaculars they brought with them. Regarding the Sephardim, I think it's applicable, this kind of principle is applicable to the emergence of other languages of the world. And I want to add to Mofuene's argument of the importance of the vernacular spoken by the founders, also the social strata and social networks. When it comes to the Sephardim, we do not know the exact numbers of Jews expelled, but it's estimated that there were around 150,000 Jews that continued to arrive throughout the 16th and 17th century from Portugal. Most of them came from Castile, that's true, but tens of thousands of Jews also came from Aragon and Portugal. And of course, the Aragonese, Catalan, and Portuguese ingredients enriched Judeo-Spanish, but we clearly see a shift towards Castilian. So when the Jews arrived after the exile, they arrived in the East, we find a mixture of mutually intelligible languages that enrich Judeo-Spanish, but we also see a shift towards Castilian, certainly first around from the elite circles, as I just shown you, that we already see Castilianization process also that affected also the Jews. And the result was the emergence of a new blend of Ibero-Romance with a strong Castilian base that was embellished with Hebraisms. What about the social strata of the founders, the first who arrived after the expulsion? So regarding the Sephardim, it's true that many Jews chose conversion, elite families in the Iberian Peninsula chose conversion over expulsion, but there is a mixture of social strata among the exiled Sephardim. also rabbinical strata, and surely among Portuguese Jews that arrived later that were from prestigious and rich families. So we see a mixture of very humble Jews and prestigious and more rich Jews and rabbinical strata, a mixture of social strata. And the Greek and Moroccan Jews were probably overwhelmed by the arrival of these kind of numbers, but they also appreciated these Jews and saw them as people with great cultural capital that have a direct continuance from Chachmei Sfarad. So they saw in them an example. What about the social networks? I mean here, I concentrate on the family structure. Sephardim moved in families, even if it was broken, half converted. And after they arrived, they were very fast to establish new families. This is very different from the situation of the emergence of Creole languages, for example, where we speak of marginalized, enslaved, single men that they were the founders of those languages, also in the colonization of the Americas. So it's very different, the case of the Sephardim. We could also say the comparable case about the emergence of Yiddish, but that's not a place to speak about it. And another factor which is very important is the contact with other languages. So at first, there is a limited influence of the lexicon of Turkish, Greek, Bulgarian, Balkan languages. And in the case of North Africa, in Morocco, the Hakitiya, the Judeo-Spanish of North Africa, Arabic influence, but it's a limited influence. The Jews did not shift to those languages, the local languages. No. They shifted to Castilian. They chose Castilian rather than the local languages, but they have some contact and influence within Judeo-Spanish for those local languages. Of course, the contact with the Hebrew is the high variety. Already in medieval time, Jews were known for their knowledge of Hebrew. It's true that after the exile, the expulsion, the knowledge deteriorated in the first generations, and the relatively stable state of diglossia, high variety Hebrew, and the spoken language Castilian or Portuguese was shaken, and Hebrew entered the vernacular, and Hebrew lexicon entered into Judeo-Spanish. This is really closely related to another factor, the long written legacy of sacred texts and the relatively high literacy among the Jews, which is a crucial component in establishing Judeo-Spanish. Once the rabbis wrote in that language, then it's an appropriate language to be written. It's already a literary language, right? And what about other languages? Italian, German, contemporary Spanish influence Judeo-Spanish, but most notably French. And I'm going to dedicate the next section to that. The influence of French in the 19th and 18th and 20th century, that's a very modern influence. After the establishment of the Alliance Française, Jews of French origins aspired to educate the Jews of the East and to culturate the Jews of the East, and schools throughout the Ottoman Empire and North Africa were established. And the influence of French was immense. A certain degree of relixification of Judeo-Spanish occurred, to the degree that Chaim Vidal-Sefika calls it Judeo-Franiol. He says that in his studies, he shows that even 20% of the lexicon comes from borrowed from French versus 15% of Turkish, 4% of Hebrew. Example of that from the borrowed lexicon, Elevo, Chapeo, Journal, Avenir, Bourreau, Monsieur, Chemin de Fer, Vapor, etc., that entered Ottoman Judeo-Spanish, you know. And more interestingly, we find structural interference of French. Marie-Christine Varol studied these and showed very interesting examples of the abundance of personal pronouns within the speech of Ottoman Judeo-Spanish speakers. where in earlier Judeo-Spanish, the personal pronouns are in marked structures, it became like French, if you want the linguistic terminology, a change from a null subject to a non-prodrop model of language, where the pronoun is added even if it's not necessary. It's not a marked structure. We see some example of word order influence and also a lexical choice. Merci mucho. Of course, the merci is taken from French. It also influenced Turkish among the Muslims as well. But I like the construction merci mucho versus muchas gracias, because it's about the noun and adverb versus adjective and then a noun. So it's interesting about the word order. We see some influence on a complexification of the system in adjectives ending with in al, in Spanish and earlier Judaismo or Judeo-Spanish. These mark principal and nacional, mark both the feminine and the masculine. But thanks to French, we have now principala and nacionala. And if you know the official Ladino authority, la Autoridad Nacional de Ladino. We now differentiate feminine and masculine. Also, we see in the possessive paradigm a change due to French leur. The form sus takes the number of the possessor rather than the number of the thing or the person possessed, and thus interfering with the whole paradigm of the possessives in Judeo-Spanish. This is the only case that it occurs within the paradigm. And saying all of that, we need to complete the picture in order to finalize what we understand about the emergence of Judeo-Spanish. We need to say something about the internal innovations of Judeo-Spanish. Judeo-Spanish is far from being a fossilized language. We need to forget about that idea, and I think scholarly literature have shown us in the last 20 years that it's not the case. So there are internal developments within Judeo-Spanish. First, we should be reminded that Judeo-Spanish never went through a complete process of standardization. And researchers such as Quintana and Hassan speak of polymorphism, that is competing variants within Judeo-Spanish speech. And also Quintana showed the existence of two koines, two centers, that of Istanbul and Salonika, that developed very interesting innovations, such as, and I'm going to touch because we don't have a lot of time, only very few morphological and phonological phenomena. In the second person in the plural, we find the form ash and esh, and not ice and ace in Castilian. And this is related to a deep phonological process. For example, the word sesh and not seis in Castilian Spanish. We have the reflexive clitic se and sen, where in Judeo-Spanish marks a plural referent. What do I mean? Mis hijos no quieren a levantarse temprano versus the Spanish, mis hijos no quieren a levantarse temprano. That is in Judeo-Spanish, they mark the plural referent. There is some indication in the medieval Castilian, in text of medieval Castilian, not only among Jews, but this form became the prominent one within Judeo-Spanish. First person preterite forms in the past are regulated of the verb of ar, ending with e and imos, canti and cantimos, similar to verbs ending with er and ir, versus the Spanish cante and cantamos. And also I should mention two phonological features that are called yeísmo and ceseo, that characterize other Spanish dialects such as Andalusian and Latin American Spanish dialects, And in Ladino, it's not the same. It's similar, but not the same. In Ladino, we also find llamar, and not Spanish llamar, the peninsular variety, and ella, and not ella. We find ceseo, partial ceseo in Ladino. Ladino is more complicated. Gracias, for example, and not the differentiation between modern Spanish gracias and casa, and etc. What does it mean? How come supposedly Andalusian and Latin American features of Spanish are also found in Ottoman Sephardic variety? So I think here it shouts that similar internal ecologies in the meaning of a linguistic system yield similar evolution in the process of linguistic accommodation, or in other words, similar phonological, morphological, and syntactic changes can occur independently from each other. An alternative and not necessarily contradictory explanation is that these phonological processes were already in progress in the spoken varieties of the Iberian Peninsula, but are not extensively documented in the writings. I'm going to conclude with a very short conclusions to open the floor for questions. We have seen the fused nature of Ladino, and I insist that it's a natural process by which languages of the world evolve in contact situation with lesser standardization pressure. The development of Jewish languages is similar to other transnational minority and immigrant languages such as Romani, Kurdish, or to other contact languages such as Creoles. I want to point to the influence of European powers. The European language, once Castilian, was favored over the local languages, Turkish, Greek, and other Balkan languages. And then in the 19th century, again, the European language, French, affected again the drastically changed Ladino to the degree that Saficha called it Judeo-Franiol. I think that the field of Jewish languages exemplify an ecological way of thinking without ever being formulated as such. And I insisted on the importance of the founders, the founder principles, not only the varieties spoken by the founders of Judeo-Spanish, but also the social strata and the social networks and family composition. With that, I finish, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you.